Over the past few years, nervous system regulation has become a super trendy topic, and rightfully so. We live in an age where people are chronically overworked and overstressed, and it's more important than ever that we keep our nervous systems in balance. Medical astrology shows us that when it comes to nervous system regulation, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. Some people require more fun, lightness, and play to replenish and rebalance their nervous system, while others require seriousness and solitude, maybe some meditation, some breath work, while some people should focus a little bit more on their diet or their exercise routines, or maybe even just prioritizing restful, restorative sleep. Now, while most people would benefit from everything I just mentioned when it comes to balancing and nourishing your nervous system, regulating your nervous system, for some people, there's going to be different priorities, and there's going to be different things that move the needle in the right direction more so than others. Why? Because we're all unique individuals with unique genetics and unique astrological blueprints that show the different lifestyle factors, circumstances, environmental exposures, personality traits, habits, and predispositions that we all carry. And that's what medical astrology shows us. It shows us how everything in our life, everything that has happened to us and is currently happening to us, is connected to our physical well-being, our physical health, and our mental health as well. And that's why I love medical astrology. It's one of my favorite topics. In this video, we're going to cover everything you need to know to understand the connections between the nervous system and medical astrology, and I'm even going to be sprinkling in some helpful tips along the way. If learning medical astrology is super exciting to you, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss an important medical astrology video or tutorial just like this one on my channel. I post new videos every single Sunday at 9 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. And also, don't forget to register for my free Medical Astrology 101 workshop at the link in the description below. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But for now, let's talk a little bit about the anatomy and physiology of the nervous system, just to make sure we're all on the same page when we get to the astrology, because I don't want anybody to be confused when I use certain terminology. And just so you know a little bit about kind of where I'm coming from with all of this, my background is actually in clinical psychology, and I did actually involve myself in some research in not just behavioral neuroscience, but specifically in stress response and looking at the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, which is really what people are talking about when they're talking about nervous system regulation. They're talking about the balance of the autonomic nervous system, which comprises of our sympathetic, which is our fight and flight response, and our parasympathetic nervous systems. And so in this video, we're going to be primarily focusing on the autonomic nervous system when we get into the medical astrology portion. However, it's important to understand how this plays into the nervous system as a whole. So essentially what the nervous system does is it responds to both internal and external changes. So changes within the body and changes outside of the body. It tells the rest of your body, all of your organs, all of your cells what to do when something shifts, something changes. And so that's the primary role of the nervous system. That's really oversimplifying it, but for the purpose of this video, I feel like that's enough. And so there are two main kind of branches of the nervous system, and everything else kind of falls under these two little umbrellas. And so that first branch is going to be the central nervous system. The central nervous system is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord, and this is essentially the main control center of the body. The brain is what signals your body, your organs, everything to function through certain electrical signals and biochemical reactions. And so the brain is super, super important, and the health of the brain is super important when it comes to the health of your nervous system, because the brain is controlling that autonomic nervous system, that fight or flight response. The particular area of the brain that's especially connected to this sympathetic versus parasympathetic activation, this stress response versus relaxation response, is the limbic system. This is because the limbic system contains the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the control center for a lot of different things, like our endocrine system. It signals the pituitary gland to release certain hormones that tell the rest of our glands to do things, but also it has a big role in regulating the autonomic nervous system, and especially our stress response. So the response to stressful or dangerous stimuli in our environment, or even in our bodies. And so the hypothalamus is super important, and the health of the limbic system is super important when it comes to overall nervous system regulation. And so we're going to talk about that a lot more when we get into the significations with the planets and all of the zodiac signs. The other kind of big umbrella category of the nervous system that we need to talk about is the peripheral nervous system. And so this is basically everything outside of the central nervous system. This is primarily ruled by Gemini, whereas the central nervous system is ruled by Mercury and all of the mutable signs, but especially Gemini and Virgo. The peripheral nervous system has a Gemini connection and also a bit of a Sagittarius connection as well. Certain different segments of the peripheral nervous system have that Sagittarian component, which we will of course talk about. But basically there are two sections of the peripheral nervous system, three really, because the enteric nervous system, which is the nervous system tied to the gut, that is sometimes kind of referred to as its own thing. Sometimes it's put under the autonomic nervous system, sometimes it's not. It just kind of depends. So you'll find that when you start studying the anatomy of the nervous system, there's a little bit of discrepancy about like where everything fits. But for the purpose of this video, we're going to talk about the afferent nervous system, which is the division that transmits signals from the rest of the body, so from like your extremities, from your organs, back to the central nervous system in the brain, and the efferent division, which transmits signals away from the brain and nervous system to the rest of your body. And that is actually the part of the peripheral nervous system that contains the autonomic nervous system, because this is being transmitted from the brain and, you know, the signals maybe in the hypothalamus out to the rest of your organs. This is where it's telling your body that it's stressed out. It's telling your adrenal glands to produce more cortisol and adrenaline. It's telling your heart to beat faster. It's telling your breathing rate to speed up. It's telling your body to prepare to run or flee or fight or, you know, to protect itself in some way. And so it's signaling your body into action versus if everything is calm and you're relaxed and the threat is no longer a threat or it's no longer viable, hopefully it's telling your body to do the opposite. One of the issues in our society today is that our brains were evolved to have this response if something really life-threatening is happening. And so if we are being chased by a bear, if we are, you know, being at war with a warring tribe or something like that, then the sympathetic nervous system should be activated. That fight or flight response should be turned on. But in this day and age, because survival depends on so many little odds and ends, we're always in fight or flight mode. So many people are in this state of chronic sympathetic nervous system overactivation, and this causes so many issues throughout the brain and the body, and eventually over time it can lead to not just mental health issues, but a lot of physical health issues as well. And so that's why we want to learn to regulate the nervous system. And that's where medical astrology comes into play, because we want to learn how to do that in the best way for us based on our unique blueprint, what our body needs, what our body has been faced with in the past, and what our body is going through in terms of levels of stress and the areas of stress right now in the moment. All of that can be seen in the birth chart, and all of that can be seen in medical astrology. And one of the first things that I like to focus on when it comes to medical astrology with my clients is looking at these nervous system triggers, because it affects so much when it comes to our health, and it is the biggest issue that we see in this day and age in modern Western society. That all being said, my little rant being over, let's start talking a little bit about the actual medical astrology part of things. But before we do, I just want to mention again, make sure you sign up for my Medical Astrology 101 workshop. It is 100% free of charge. You're going to learn so much about medical astrology in all of the correspondences. If you've been wanting to start learning this ancient and technical art, but you haven't known where to start, or you've struggled in the past with learning in a haphazard way or with courses that are not structured or cohesive, this is for you. So as long as you have a little bit of a background with understanding astrology, you're going to get a lot out of this workshop. It's happening February 29th for the live workshop, although by the time you watch this, that one might be full. But we have 5 live replays that you can attend where you're going to get to interact with me and my team in the chat, ask your questions, get answers in real time, and so I'm super excited for that. And this is also the time period when I'm going to be opening enrollment for my paid course, Medical Astrology Foundation, so just keep an eye out if that's something you're interested in too, if you want to actually become a medical astrologer. All right, so let's start with the most obvious, which is Mercury. Mercury, of course, rules the brain and the nervous system as a whole. It is your nerves. And so Mercury is going to tell us a lot about the functioning of your nervous system, the health, what types of issues you might be prone to, what types of stressors might be more influential in your life, and what you really need to do in order to keep your autonomic nervous system regulated and balanced. With Mercury, you want to really look at things like the house placement of Mercury. So is Mercury in a house that is benefic or malefic? You're going to want to look at the sign, especially that Mercury's in. Is Mercury in its home sign or its exaltation, so in Gemini or in Virgo, or is it in its detriment in the sign of Sagittarius, or is it in its fall in the sign of Pisces? People with Mercury in Pisces tend to have very sensitive nervous systems. They're sensitive not just to stress and stressful situations, but they're sensitive to energy and emotions in their environment. They're going to be sensitive to toxins and chemicals, and even things like electromagnetic frequencies can disrupt their nervous system because it's so malleable. There's no good barriers between what's going on internally and what's going on externally, especially when it comes to the nervous system. And so that's going to make somebody more prone to having dysregulation just based on the environment that they're in any given moment in time. All of the water signs need more rest and restoration. And all of the water signs are going to have issues where their emotions are going to be a triggering factor for nervous system imbalance more so than anything else. And so working on emotional regulation, working on emotional expression, working on, dealing with trapped or stuck emotions from the past, not putting yourself in situations that are overly emotionally taxing all of the time, giving yourself that space will be super important for Mercury in the water signs. Mercury in the earth signs tends to be a little bit more grounded and regulated when it comes to the nervous system. They need more structure, more routine. They need regimented regularity in their health routines, really, but in everything. So the way that you can kind of regulate the nervous system for a Mercury earth sign person, and so that's Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn, is by adding structure and routine when things start to get overwhelming, when you start to feel frazzled, when you start to feel like your nervous system is going haywire. That's when you need to ground yourself through creating stabilizing, routine, kind of monotonous things that help to keep things steady and stable. Also for Mercury in the earth signs, actual grounding and earthing can be very important. So kind of discharging that energy and recharging through actually planting your feet or your body on the earth, going outside, being in nature. That's going to be amazing for Earth Mercuries because the earth signs are connected to GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter that actually calms us. It's implicated in things like anxiety, and going outside and essentially bathing in the earth, in nature, going on a nature walk increases GABA. And so that can be a really wonderful thing for helping to balance and regulate the earth energy, or if you don't have enough earth energy in your chart, but that's a whole nother topic and a whole nother video in and of itself. But if you have Mercury in the air signs, things like chanting or breath work or talking it out or writing lists or journaling or listening to soothing, calming sounds and music, using frequency to regulate the nervous system, whether that's actual like auditory frequency or, sound waves, or if it's other things like actual like electronic frequencies, or using some sort of electronic means to regulate the nervous system. Like for example, there are certain actual electronic devices, these biohacking devices, that can be used to stimulate and tone the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve has a lot to do with the autonomic nervous system and your stress response. And so having low vagal tone can put you more in sympathetic. Having better vagal tone can put you more into parasympathetic. And so you can get these devices that you clip to your ears. I've actually tried them and they seem to work over time, can actually help to regulate the nervous system. And it could be a really great way to kind of hack the nervous system for those who have Mercury in the air signs. And also for Mercury in the air signs, especially if you are an Aquarius Mercury, you need to be very careful about electronic frequencies in your environment, electromagnetic frequencies in your environment. So things that they tell you to do, like turning off the Wi-Fi at night, or just not having Wi-Fi and hardwiring everything like we do in our home, or making sure that you're not having your phone right next to your face, putting it on airplane mode, getting yourself out of the city when you can, where there's not as many of those frequencies. That can really help you, especially during times when you're feeling extra frazzled. And then for Mercury in the fire signs, Mercury fire sign people, they need to take action. They need to move their bodies. If you have a fire sign Mercury, or Mercury in some sort of alignment with Mars, like a conjunction, square, opposition, or even a trine or sextile, that means that you need activity. Physical activity and movement is absolutely crucial to regulate your nervous system. It's crucial for everyone. That's actually part of, a nervous system regulation protocol, is intentional movement and the right kind of movement for your body. And Mercury and Aries people, they need higher levels of activity and more intensive physical activity to regulate their nervous systems. Whereas Mercury in the water signs, for example, would potentially not benefit from that as much. They might need slower, more like methodical, more relaxing forms of movement. And so you'd have to look at the whole chart to really get a good picture for what this looks like. But definitely Mercury in the fire signs, they need to discharge some of this energy, and they need to move their bodies in some way in order to feel calm, centered, and regulated. Also, Mercury in the fire signs tends to be more prone to inflammation of the nervous system. So, and that can actually be a big issue when it comes to certain things like anxiety or depression. It has been shown that there is a link to inflammation and inflammatory markers, and those two mental health issues. And so especially if you have Mercury in a fire sign and you are prone to anxiety, this is something that you need to take into consideration, because the right types of movement for your body can help reduce that anxiety and reduce that inflammation. But also you have to look at the foods that you're eating and making sure that you're not eating foods that are pro-inflammatory. You also can look at things like supplementation. There's so much you can do to decrease that inflammation of the nervous system. And so that's something also to consider with Mercury in the fire signs. And so the next planet we have to talk about is the moon. Yes, surprisingly, the moon is hugely connected to the brain and to nervous system health, nervous system regulation. Not only is the moon representative of our inner world, our emotional experience, and our emotional expression, but it's heavily tied to the limbic system of the brain. And if you recall from our very, very short mini neuroanatomy lesson, the limbic system contains the hypothalamus, and this is part of the control center for the autonomic nervous system. The limbic system is responsible for all sorts of different things, but primarily it has to do with that fight or flight response, our response to stimuli, but also memory function, because it contains the hippocampus, and especially emotional memory, because it also contains the amygdala, which is the control center for emotion in the brain. And so there you go with that tie into the moon, but also emotional memory and and episodic memory function is tied to the limbic system. Episodic memory is the type of memory that we experience when we're thinking back or recalling specific events in our lives, almost as if a movie is playing in our brains when we think back to the good old days, or that really scary event that happened, or whatever it is that we're trying to conjure up. That memory is stored through the hippocampus. The moon is also connected to different protective membranes and cells and lubricating fluids and things like that throughout the body and the nervous system. And so the moon, when it comes to the brain and nervous system, is connected to the meninges and also to the glial cells. And so the glial cells are kind of these protective, nurturing cells for the neurons in our brain. And a lot of people refer to the glial cells as the glymph because they do comprise part of the brain's immune system. And some people think that it's kind of like the lymphatic system of the brain, or part of the lymphatic system of the brain. Not all the glial cells do this, but some of them do. And so it's super important in that way. And the other thing that the moon is tied to when it comes to the nervous system is the process of myelination. And so if there's an issue with myelination, then that would show up in connection with the moon. And so that's why the moon is important to look at. It has this super strong connection to our emotional experience and our inner world, of course, on a more general level, but it's tied to certain centers and processes within the brain, and also certain protective layers and membranes and mechanisms within the nervous system as well. And so looking at the moon's placement in terms of the sign that it's in, the house that it's in, and the aspects that it's making in your chart can tell you a lot about the health of those different processes, those different areas. The next thing you want to look at are the mutable signs. Why? Because taken as a whole, the mutable signs rule the nervous system in its entirety, with each sign having a more specialized connection to a different portion of the nervous system. And so the two that have the biggest, closest association to the nervous system as a whole are going to be Gemini and Virgo. This is in part due to their rulership, which is Mercury. So Mercury rules both of these signs, and as you already know from earlier in this video, Mercury is hugely connected to the brain and the nervous system in a general sense. Gemini rules literally the whole nervous system in general. It can be more tied to the peripheral nervous system. If you think about Gemini in terms of its other body rulerships, it's kind of like the arms and the extremities and things like that. And it's also this kind of energy of communication. And so the communication between like the brain and the rest of the body, that's a very Gemini thing. Virgo is the one that's most closely connected to the autonomic nervous system. And so if you think about the general significations of the sign of Virgo, this makes sense. Virgos are known to be a little anxious, a little nervous, a little bit more uptight, a little bit more unsettled, because they are a mutable sign. And so this mutable earth energy can show up in a predisposition toward just being a little bit more unsettled, a little bit more on edge, a little bit more prone maybe to nervousness or even anxiety in its extreme form. And so the autonomic nervous system is tied more closely to Virgo than the other mutable signs. And also tied to Virgo is the enteric nervous system. And so the enteric nervous system is the nervous system connected to the gut. Virgo rules the intestines, especially the small intestine, but the intestines as a whole. And so the enteric nervous system innervates the intestines, and so this would make a lot of sense. Sagittarius is more the efferent nervous system, more generally. Pisces in general is probably the least connected to the nervous system. It's primarily tied to the nervous system through what I always call referred influence in my classes. This is essentially where there is an influence in one sign of one modality, and it translates over to other signs of the same modality, especially signs that are in the opposition. So that Virgo energy can show up, or those Virgo significations in medical astrology can show up with Pisces placements, and vice versa. Those energies of Gemini, the medical astrology significations, can show up in Sagittarius and vice versa. And so these things show up very commonly once you get really deep into the weeds of learning and understanding medical astrology. If this is something that's interesting to you, we do talk about this type of referred influence, these kind of crosses with the different modalities and what they mean in medical astrology in my Medical Astrology 101 workshop, which again is free. You can sign up down at the link below if you do so before February 29th. So if you're watching this well into the future, it might not exist anymore. And so that's the mutable signs. From there, we need to talk about Mars. Mars rules the adrenals. It is our fight or flight response. It's our immune system and our immune response, but it's also that fight or flight sympathetic nervous system activation. It's definitely tied to adrenal hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, and all of these are implicated in our fight or flight response, in our stress response in the body. And so looking at Mars and the placement of Mars can tell you a lot. If you have a dysfunctional Mars energy, where Mars is in a difficult house, if Mars especially is in a sign that it doesn't like to be in, like in its detriment or at its fall, or if Mars is in challenging aspects with other planets in the birth chart, this can show difficulties involving that fight or flight response, involving the adrenals, involving the sympathetic nervous system as a whole. And so we do want to look at that Mars energy. Mars also is connected to inflammation. And we talked about how that nervous system, that neurogenic inflammation can contribute to dysregulation of the nervous system and things like anxiety or even depression. And so looking at Mars as an inflammatory marker can be helpful as well. And so moving on from Mars, the next thing we want to look at are the cardinal signs, partially because they're tied in with the endocrine system as a whole. So when you're looking at the cardinal signs, you're looking at endocrine system energy through that cross, through that referred influence that we talked about. I'm not going to get into the individual signs and all of their significations, except for Aries, which rules the adrenals and the adrenal hormones. And so there's a connection there between Aries, which is ruled by Mars, which has to do with the adrenals and those adrenal hormones as well, and the sympathetic nervous system. And so because of the Aries connection to the adrenals, this can actually be referred as an influence into a lot of the other cardinal signs. There are other reasons for this as well that we could go into, but it would take a bajillion years. And again, we're getting into that in the Medical Astrology 101 workshop, so definitely check that out if you want to know more about this. But the cardinal signs also in general deal with crisis. And so especially if you have a lot of squares and oppositions, or like a big stellium in the cardinal signs, that shows that this is a person who has had to deal with a lot of crisis, things that come up suddenly, that even if they're not necessarily viewed as a crisis from the outside looking in, that person views these experiences throughout their lifetime as some sort of crisis. And every time this square, this opposition, this stellium, this grand cardinal cross, whatever it is activated by certain timing indicators like transits, this person is re-experiencing some form of crisis. And so being prone to having these crisis situations is very important to make note of and to understand if you're looking at something like a person's nervous system and nervous system regulation and the health of their nervous system. It can even help you predict when things are going to come up and become a crisis again, so you can plan and prepare in advance, so you can do the work ahead of time so your body isn't thrown into that state of chronic sympathetic fight or flight overactivation. Now finally, last but maybe not least, we have to talk about the fire signs. And so the fire signs are Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. And an excess of fire in the birth chart can just indicate that a person is prone to overstimulation across many areas of their life and within the body. And that can include the nervous system. A fire deficiency, on the other hand, can create understimulation or some sort of deficiency, a lack of ambition or apathy. So maybe that person needs to be more stimulated in order to balance and regulate their nervous system. You see how there's a lot of layers here and how this can get kind of complicated? So definitely, if you are interested in learning more and kind of getting more nuance with this, figuring out how to actually utilize this information more in practice, check out my Medical Astrology 101 workshop. Again, it's free. The link is down in the description below. And definitely join the waitlist for my Medical Astrology Foundations course. course. Enrollment opens on February 29th of 2024. And yeah, that's where we're going to get really, really deep into all of this stuff in a very intricate and interesting way. If this felt like it was a little over your head right now, it won't by the time we get into the weeds of things in the workshop and in the actual paid course. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, let me know in the comments section, because I would love to do more medical astrology content for you guys. Like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye everyone.